This video is about how we build noun phrases in English, which is fantastically complicated. However, we're not going to have to go over every little detail. We're going to go over the basics. What this should help you do is exercise 5 on page 111, which is part of your individual analysis. What that exercise asks you to do is look at certain phrases and identify their category and their function. Each of the phrases occurs inside a noun phrase. So remember the difference between category and function. This will be crucial. Category, you have only a very few choices, right? It can be a noun, it can be a verb, an adjective, a determinative, that sort of thing. It doesn't depend on what it's doing in the phrase. That's separate. That's the function. The function is what something's doing in a phrase, like if it's the modifier or if it's the head, if it's a complement. Function can also refer to what a phrase is doing in a clause, like is it the subject, is it the direct object, the indirect object, that sort of thing. An adjunct. All of these are going to ask, all the questions in this exercise are going to ask about the function inside a noun phrase. And they're going to ask about the category. So if you can keep those two separate and you understand how a noun phrase can be built, you'll do well here. So what we're going to go over right now are the elements of a noun phrase. We're going to practice identifying the elements, and we're going to mention their categories too, so that we can help keep that straight. So inside a noun phrase, basically you can have 5 elements. The head has to be a noun. I know that seems really obvious, but in context it's not always really obvious. You can always double check with yourself. Am I understanding this noun phrase by understanding that there's a noun that's its head? If you're not seeing what noun is the head, then something basic is off and you need to rethink the boundaries of the noun phrase. Okay, so the head will be a noun, and then you can, all of these things are optional, right? If there's just a noun head, sometimes that's enough for a phrase, depending on which noun you choose for the head. But here are the optional elements. There can be determiners, complements, and internal modifiers and external modifiers. So let's look at how each of those work. First of all, let's consider the determiners. Now, technically determiners are modifiers. Don't even worry about that. Just call them determiners. The categories that usually function as determiners, determinatives, obviously, right? Or determinative phrases, and then genitive noun phrases. It's pretty much only those two, so these aren't too hard to pick out. All right, let's look at some determinatives and determinative phrases inside noun phrases. And I look forward this year to further examining new ways for the association to utilize social networking. There are several noun phrases in that sentence. Look at 2 of them. Look at this year. That's a noun phrase, right? The head of the phrase is year, obviously. The word this is a determinative. That's its class. What its function is, it's the determiner. It may seem picky to separate determinative and determiner. For your purposes, it probably is. When you do a more complex analysis, there are good reasons why those aren't always the same thing, so don't worry about that. Another example, just exactly parallel, is the association. Association is the head. The is a determinative functioning as a determiner. Now, here's a determinative phrase, and in very many ways, I think that's exactly where we are right now. Focus on the noun phrase very many ways. Ways is the head. Many is a determinative. That's its class. And very is an adverb. They can modify determinatives, right? When you put them together, you get a determinative phrase. And that determinative phrase, very many, is functioning as a determiner in the noun phrase very many ways. Another one like that, in the last sentence, virtually any notion. Notion is the head of the phrase, right? Any is a determinative. It could be by itself. His willingness to test any notion that pops into his head, that's good. But somebody wanted to modify any, so they said virtually any. Virtually is modifying any. Again, it's an adverb, modifying a determinative. It's forming a determinative phrase. The function of that determinative phrase, it's a determiner. So those are determinative phrases. The other kind of determiner is the genitive noun phrase. So we go back to that sentence, but look at the noun phrase at the end. His head. Okay, head is the head of the phrase, haha. And his is also a noun phrase, but it's not being a noun phrase of its own. What it's doing is being a determiner inside a bigger noun phrase. It is being a noun phrase, but it's being one inside a bigger noun phrase. It has a function, it's a determiner. Genitive noun phrases can be quite a bit bigger than the word his. Look at this one. The human body's largest gland. So the human body's is the genitive form of the noun phrase the human body, right? That z there, that genitiveness doesn't just modify body, it modifies the whole noun phrase, right? So the human body's is a determiner inside the noun phrase, the human body's largest gland. Gland is the head of the phrase, and largest is an adjective, a modifier. We'll talk about those in a minute. Another example of a genitive noun phrase being a determiner. Their children's strengths and areas of need. Right? Their children's modifies both strengths and areas of need. It's the determiner to that coordinated noun phrase. So those are the two kinds of determiners you need to worry about. The determinative phrase ones and the genitive noun phrase ones. Now we get to complements. Also two kinds of complements that we'll deal with. Prepositional phrase complements for nouns are really common. And subordinate clauses can also be complements of nouns. Here are some examples of prepositional phrases. A schoolgirl passion for model horses. Okay, now the whole noun phrase is a schoolgirl passion for model horses. Passion is the head, right? Is a determinative. Schoolgirl is a modifier. Don't worry about that right now. Look at the end. For model horses. Now, why am I saying that for model horses is a complement and not an adjunct? Remember when you did that exercise on distinguishing complements from adjuncts? Remember how the key property was that complements have to be licensed? So if there's not a licensing element there, the complement becomes illegal, the phrase becomes illegal. So imagine that we have switched interest here. A schoolgirl passion is very much like a schoolgirl interest, right? Conceptually, semantically, they're quite alike. Passion is stronger. But look at the second sentence, the interest in deep ocean microbiology. Notice that you can't say a schoolgirl passion in model horses. And you can't say a schoolgirl interest for model horses. Passion selects a prepositional phrase starting with for. And interest selects a prepositional phrase starting with in. They can't use each other's prepositional phrases. You know what I'm talking about, right? Licensing. Certain nouns license certain prepositional phrases. That's why we call them complements. Now, there are other prepositional phrases that are just adjuncts. You remember analyzing in the sea? And I claimed that that was an adjunct. Many of you claimed that that was an adjunct too, because there wasn't any verb there that we couldn't put in the sea after, right? They swam in the sea, they thought in the sea, they talked in the sea, they preached in the sea. However, a lot of times prepositional phrases inside noun phrases are in fact complements, and you can tell if you try to swap out a different noun or a different preposition and it doesn't work. So that is one kind of complement. And then the other kind is a subordinate clause. Now check out this. The fact that millions have been tattooed. Millions have been tattooed is a clause, right? With a subordinator, that. You see it? Millions is the subject, have is the verb, and tattooed is the complement. Right? But that whole clause is inside the noun phrase, of which fact is the head. You could substitute a pronoun for this whole noun phrase, right? The fact that millions have been tattooed. This whole noun phrase, you could say despite that. Right? That's because all of that belongs to one noun phrase. The head, of course, is fact. The is, of course, a determiner, a determinative functioning as a determiner, right? And then there's this clause that millions have been tattooed. And what's it doing? It's a complement. Why am I arguing that? Because some nouns license them and some don't. Look at this one. The explanation that he's a serious guy, not an attention getter, is valid. So what explanation is it? Somebody explained that he's a serious guy, not an attention getter. Right? So it's the explanation that blah, blah, blah. The noun phrase complements explanation. The noun phrase is licensed by explanation. Look at what happens if we change explanation to discussion, which is conceptually pretty similar, right? The discussion that he's a serious guy, not an attention getter. Oh no, very bad sentence. You can't have a discussion that's something. Why not? You just can't. It doesn't license it. It's in the grammar. It's a grammar rule. It's not a logic rule. So therefore, when we have noun phrases that have a noun followed by a subordinate clause, we say that the subordinate clause is a complement. How about modifiers? Okay, now let's split up modifiers into the internal ones and the external ones. The internal ones are mainly what we're going to look at. The external ones we'll do very little with, so don't worry. The internal ones are a little more worrisome. We can further split them up just for convenience, okay? And we'll talk about the ones that come before the head of the phrase and the ones that come after the head of the phrase. Okay, before the head of the phrase, there are 4 categories that can function as internal modifiers. Adjective phrases, determiner phrases, nouns, and verb phrases. So first let's look at the adjective phrases. These will be familiar to you. In the first sentence, here's a big noun phrase. This lengthy explanation that he was taking these prescription drugs. You see an adjective? Lengthy, right? Remember, we can identify adjectives. Remember this category, these category tests? We can identify adjectives because most often they can be modified by the word very. So very tall, very interesting, very flamboyant. Those are adjectives, right? Usually, they can take a comparative and a superlative form. Lengthier, lengthiest. Right? There are other criteria, but those are the 2 that you look for right off the bat. All right? Lengthy works. Something can be very lengthy, and we have lengthier and lengthiest. So here's this big noun phrase that starts with a determinative acting as a determiner. And then it has this adjective acting as an internal modifier. The class is adjective. The function is internal modifier. And then it has the head. And then it has a clause. That's a complement, right? And then look for just a minute And this other noun phrase that's inside the clause of the complement, these prescription drugs. What I want you to notice about this noun phrase is that you may be tempted to call prescription an adjective. In traditional analyses, probably I'm thinking including the ones that you were shown in high school, the claim is if a noun modifies another noun, it's an adjective. But here's the thing, a noun isn't an adjective. That's a contradiction in terms in our system. Okay? Remember how we were identifying adjectives. First, the most likely tests are they can be modified by very, and they have comparative and superlative forms. Look at prescription. These very prescription drugs. No. Prescription or drugs. Prescription is drugs. No. Prescription is a noun, right? It has a plural form. Prescription, prescriptions. And it can form the head of a noun phrase. These prescriptions. Right? That's a noun. The fact that it's modifying drugs just tells us that that's its function. Its class is still noun. Its function is internal modifier. So that one is not an adjective. We're going to see a few more of those in a minute. But lengthy was an adjective. Now how about well-tested explanation? Yeah, very well-tested, more well-tested. Yeah. So here, a well-tested explanation that unifies a broad range of observations. So once again, you've got a determiner, an internal modifier, the head, and then a clause complement. And if we want to look inside the clause complement, here's another noun phrase we can play with, a broad range of observations. Determiner, adjective acting as internal modifier, broad, broader, right? Very broad. Head noun, prepositional phrase complement. Cool, huh? One more. A rather large power plant for a proof of concept experiment. Okay, this one, you can see that the adjective phrase can be more than just an adjective. Sometimes the adjective has a modifier, as in this case, rather modifies large. Right? It could be a somewhat large. It could be a very large. So, what do we say about large? Its category is adjective. What do we say about its function? It doesn't have a function by itself. What it does is if it makes a phrase with rather, and that adjective phrase, rather large, has the function of, you know it, right? Internal modifier. Okay, so adjective phrases, and sometimes that's just an adjective, and sometimes the adjective has a modifier with it. That's one kind of internal modifier. Determiner phrases, you pretty much already saw. This becomes real obvious when there are two determinative phrases in a row. So here you have the, right? And then you have only few hundred. So what we'll do in this case is we'll call the first one the external modifier, and this one the internal modifier. The internal one is, of course, closer to the head, individuals. Right? Don't stress about that. Just when you see two of them in a row, I don't think there are any questions like that in your analysis that ask you to distinguish between an internal determinative for internal modifier determinative phrase and an external modifier determinative phrase. So just, be aware that they can occur two in a row because one is inside the nominal and the other one is outside it. Don't worry about that. You'll actually see external ones in a few minutes. So focus more on this other kind of internal modifier, which we talked about, nouns. Nouns can modify other nouns, like a brick wall, right? Brick is not an adjective. The Oval Office, oval is not an adjective. Sometimes nouns modify other nouns. Here's an example for you. Day cruise riverboat. Day cruise riverboats. A day cruise is a thing, right? It's a noun. It can have a plural, day cruises. Although we wouldn't use the hyphen, but that's just a writing problem. The other one in this clause, U.S. rivers. Now, if we said American, we'd get an adjective, right? But U.S. is a noun. It's the U.S. We don't have any problem making a noun modify another noun. English does that all the time. So we have adjective phrases and nouns acting as internal modifiers before the head of the clause. Another thing that can come in that position is non-finite clauses. Remember the non-finite ones, the head of the clause is not a primary verb form. It can be a gerund participle, or it can be a past participle, or it can be an infinitive. But most of the examples you'll see of finite clauses modifying the noun inside a noun phrase are going to have as a head gerund participles or past participles. So here are a couple examples of those. There was actually one in that sentence that we already looked at. These floating hotels is a noun phrase. And we know that these is a determinative functioning as a determiner. And we know that floating is a verb, right? It's taking the ing like verbs do. And it could take the past tense, floated, right? It does all the things that verbs do. It agrees with its subject. So we know that's a verb. And it's all by itself there, so it's forming a verb phrase. But it's a non-finite verb phrase because it's a gerund participle. And what is it modifying? Hotels, naturally. So you have, as the class of it, right, is a non-finite clause. And the function of it, it's an internal modifier. Here's one that's headed by a past participle. Visibly worn patches. Now the whole noun phrase here is no visibly worn patches or holes. Right? And that's coordinated. And one of the phrases that's coordinated is visibly worn patches. No is the determiner, right? And then the first noun phrase that's coordinated inside there is visibly worn patches. Patches is, of course, the head. Visibly is, of course, an adverb, and it's describing a verb, right? Worn is a verb in its past participle form. There's no subject or anything, and that's fine because this is a non-finite clause. So, visibly worn is the non-finite clause, that's its category, it's the internal modifier, that's its function to patches, the head of the clause. And those are the ones that can come before the head of the clause, most of the ones. Adjective phrases, nouns, and non-finite clauses. Now how about after the head of the clause? You can get even more, I'm afraid. However, these occur less often, but there is a wide range of them. You can get prepositional phrases, adjective phrases, noun phrases, and finite clauses and non-finite clauses. So let's look first at the prepositional phrase modifiers. How about this sentence? We look at the people in the room. People is the head of the phrase, and then in the room, what's that doing there? It's modifying people. Right? So we look at them, right? Notice that the pronoun would replace the people in the room. That's all one noun phrase. In the room is not modifying the verb. It's modifying people. So a prepositional phrase can come after the head and modify the head. Right? The category would be prepositional phrase, the function would be modifier. Okay, how about an adjective phrase coming after the head? She's in a room full of her best friends. Full is an adjective, right? We can say very full and we can say fuller and fullest. So the head of this phrase obviously is room. Full is the head of this adjective phrase, full of her best friends. Its function is adjective phrase, and its category is adjective phrase, its function is modifier. Noun phrases, yes, sometimes you get a noun phrase modifying a head noun phrase, but coming, so you have two that come right in a row. So let's check in with meteorologist Monica McNeil. This you'll know as an appositive probably. The appositive noun phrases are considered internal modifiers coming after their head. Also, you can get something like this. If somebody that size takes testosterone, that size is a noun phrase, right? Size is a noun, and that is the determinative inside there. But the head of this bigger noun phrase is somebody. So noun phrases can come after their head and modify them. Now finite clauses. These are mainly relative clauses, and there's a whole unit, well, there's most of a unit on them at the end of a book. There's a lot of material on relative clauses, so don't stress about them right now. Just be able to recognize them. There is at least one of these in your exercise. Notice that the head of the phrase here is somebody. You could drop the rest, right? You can drop the modifiers. Maybe if they have somebody, that would be okay, right? You could also replace the whole phrase. Maybe if they have one, right? Those tests indicate that somebody that steps forward that wants to volunteer is just one noun phrase. All of that's in the same noun phrase. And somebody is the head. Then there are two clauses, right? That steps forward is a clause. That is a subject, it's a pronoun. Steps forward, steps is a verb really. And forward is a complement. Don't worry about that. That steps forward. It's just like I step forward, right? It's a clause. And this one's kind of cool because there are two in a row. That wants to volunteer. It's just like I want to volunteer, right? It's a clause. All right? And they're finite because of their verb forms. These are the present tense, right? This is the third singular present, in both cases. So primary forms, these are finite clauses. What are they doing? They're modifying somebody. Relative clauses come after the head. They usually start with that or who, or which, but there are a lot of cases in English where we can drop that. So here's an example of that for you in the next one. I resorted to a technique I call the untack. It could be a technique that I call the untack, right? But it doesn't have to be there. That doesn't have to be there to make the non-finite clause a relative clause that modifies the head. It's the answer to which technique, right? Basically, technique is I resorted to a technique would be okay. But that I call the untack is giving more information. It's modifying technique. So finite clauses is a category that can be an internal modifier. And non-finite clauses can do it too. A living room with 9 people looking at you. The numbers are determinatives, functioning as determiners. Looking at you, what is that doing? It's modifying people, right? But it doesn't have a subject. And its head verb is a gerund participle, so it's non-finite. No problem, it's still an internal modifier. Here's one where the head is a past participle. People born after 1981. This sentence is bad semantically, right? People born after 1981, you would argue that this is not an age, right? So the meaning doesn't work here, but that's not relevant. The grammar works perfectly, and we would let that slide in conversation, right? Because we can tell what he means. And he's following the rules of syntax. People born after 1981 is a good noun phrase because the non-finite clause can modify people. So the internal modifiers that can come after the head included prepositional phrases, adjective phrases, noun phrases, and both finite and non-finite clauses. That's pretty much all you need to know. Just look at the external modifiers for a second. I'm just giving you the book examples because these don't occur very often, and this is kind of too complicated for us to really go into. Look at the phrase, all the children. 2 determinatives, right? All the children. And yet you can't say that one of them is modifying the other. What you would say is that all is modifying the children. right? It's not just modifying the. So what you have here is the children, a noun phrase, and then all is modifying that noun phrase, but it's sort of outside its boundaries. So you call all the external modifier, the external DP, determiner. And you call the internal determiner, the internal modifier. It doesn't matter if you call it a modifier or not. Another example, such a disaster. Is a good determiner, right? A disaster is fine. Such doesn't modify You can't make a phrase with such right? There would have to be something following that. That's because such is modifying not but a disaster, the whole thing. So you have a disaster as a phrase. You have such outside, modifying it from the outside. Now here, too risky a venture. Too does modify risky, right? Something's too risky, something's very risky, something's not risky enough. So too risky is a phrase. Can you tell what kind? You know what risky is, right? Right, adjective phrase. So too risky is an adjective phrase. And then you have a determiner here. This is different from the phrases where you had the determiner and then an adjective phrase and then you had noun, like a little boy. Those are more common, right? But you can do it this way sometimes. And when you have your determiner and your head, a venture, and then you put an adjective phrase outside of that, you call it an external modifier. And then this can happen with the reflexive pronouns. So the final example I want to show you is the boss herself. That one's also in the book. The boss is a phrase, is a noun phrase, and then you can tack on the modifier herself at the end. Sometimes the external ones come afterwards rather than before, too. So the crucial thing, when you go to do the exercise, remember that for categories you have a limited list of choices, and you can go back to the list of categories very early in the book, I think chapter 2 maybe, and just check that your category is one of those, or it could be a phrase, right? I mean, your category list includes things like noun, adjective, verb, but some of these will be a noun, phrase, adjective, phrase, verb, phrase, right? So establish that first. As far as function, now remember to talk about the function inside the noun phrase. The function of the whole noun phrase in the clause is a different question. So don't say things like it's a subject or it's a direct object. It won't be. It won't be because we're not asking about a clause that has a subject and maybe a direct object. We're asking about a noun phrase, and the only things it has, a head, modifiers, and complements. And I would split out determiners just to make this simpler. But if you want to lump determiners in with modifiers, you do that. And you don't have to say if the modifiers are internal or external either. All right, so for the function, say it's the head, it's a complement, or it's a modifier, or it's a determiner.